Yeah, absolutely. Well, we will be able to see the kind of impacts that Trump might make with early voting opening this weekend. Today, we're joined by public policy major and poll worker here in New York State, Elijah Fisher. He joins us today to discuss early voting, which opens tomorrow in New York State, and poll working as an active civil service. Thank you so much for joining us, Elijah.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Of course. So let's get started. Our first topic is the idea of early voting. So early voting in New York State opens up tomorrow, as we previously mentioned. Could you detail to our listeners why early voting is so important?
Early voting, as we all know, is very important for all voters, especially people who may have an issue voting on election day for whatever reason. I know in my experience, as we all know, the lines on election day, especially this year, will be very, very long. And with early voting, particularly in New York, having the option to vote on 10 days instead of just one, that's 9 days of early voting plus election day, will give multiple options to many people. In fact, as people may know, New York is actually on the later side of in-person early voting, starting only tomorrow instead of I think mid-September for some states. And as a poll worker, I will be working a few of those days for early voting, and early voting hours mean that there are 98 hours where one person can vote as opposed to just the 15 on election day.
Cool, thank you. So kind of going off of that too, what are some ways or methods that people typically vote early?
So I'm glad you asked that. There is, of course, in-person early voting. There is also mail-in ballots and absentee. I believe in New York, there isn't no excuse mail-in ballot. You do have to provide some sort of excuse, but there is no excuse early voting. And with early voting, you are allowed to vote at any poll site in your county, not just your assigned poll site, which may be helpful for some people who work away from where they live and are able to go to a poll site near their job as opposed to having to go to the one next to their place of residence. I know for me, having early voting is very helpful as a student. It's hard to just go on election day, and especially if I weren't working the polls. And having the option to vote and having multiple options to vote, I think is very important for everyone to express their voice in this democracy.
Going off of that, I'm curious from a personal standpoint, when someone's trying to decide whether they should early vote or just go on election day, what kind of goes into that decision, and what advice would you give someone?
That's a very interesting question. I think at this point in our democracy, with Election Day being on a Tuesday, which people can give their opinions about that, I think there is, though, a sense of pride of going on Election Day to your assigned polling site and saying, I cast my vote on Election Day. I know, speaking to my parents, despite the fact that it's slightly more inconvenient for them to do so, they still choose to do that just to say, I did it on Election Day. But I think having early voting, especially since you're able to vote at any site, not just your assigned site, at least in New York, it is by far the more convenient option. I do think we will still see people do it on Election Day more out of ritual and just, again, a sense of pride. But I think for people who maybe haven't voted a lot before, maybe this is the first time voting, I would recommend voting early, because I find in my experience, with less people, there's less of a pressure to just, do it quickly and move on. Especially for the poll workers, we're able to give more of a more attention to each individual voter to make sure they know how to operate the equipment, fill out their ballots, et cetera, et cetera. I also want to mention for voters with disabilities, there is a machine called an AutoMark at all polling locations. People with disability, actually anyone is allowed to use this machine. They just have to ask, so please don't feel shy. But and the AutoMark has equipment for Braille, equipment for visually impaired. It even has a thing, I can't remember what they called it, where people who are are slightly paralyzed, you can like blow into a straw to vote. And of course, we also have procedures for voter assistance where a voter is allowed to ask really just about anyone except for like a person running for office to assist them to vote. That person has to fill out some paperwork. The voter needs to affirm that they are accepting this assistance, and then that person can help the voter cast their votes. There are really a lot of options for everyone to vote, and I think, especially in this election, that everyone should take advantage of at least one of these options, yes.
Yeah, you spoke a little bit about how as a poll worker, you're able to, assist and really, personalize to people who come and vote early. So what other impacts does early voting have on poll workers like yourself?
I'm also glad you asked that. With early voting increasing the hours to 98 hours of voting instead of just 15, which it would be on election day, for me, I know like that's 98 hours I could possibly be working instead of just 15. Now, not every poll worker is able to do early voting. There aren't as many poll workers needed, and sometimes people have jobs and stuff. I know I will not be able to do all 98 hours of early voting because I'm a college student, I have class. But the fact that there are more hours, I can get paid more and also do more of a civic duty, that might be a motivation for some people to do the job, to keep the job. There's also a policy in Nassau County where you must have worked a previous election in order to work early voting. And I know for me, it's like a stepping stone, It's like I'm the next thing up the ladder. Early voting is slightly different than election day. I think there isn't really evidence to back this up, but there's sort of the mindset that there will be a slightly different audience, with, as I said, some people having the pride of voting on election day. And I think being able to assist the people who are voting early, maybe a slightly different audience, as I said, is just a source of civic pride for me.
Gotcha. And Elijah, first of all, thank you so much for joining us. Quick question though, how can people go about finding where to early vote if they want to?
You can go to, I think it's nassauvotes.com, or maybe .org, I don't know. Nassau Votes, and you can click early voting. There are, I believe, 16 to 20 different sites in Nassau County. You can come to any of them. And if you are registered to vote in another county in New York and are voting absentee, you can also come to any of those sites and drop off the absentee ballot. It will go in a special yellow box, and that yellow box will be hand-delivered by the supervisor to the Board of Elections every night. So your ballot will get counted. Please don't think that if you give your absentee ballot to someone at the polling site that it's just going to go in their car and forget about it. That is against the law. It will not happen.
So when it comes to working at polls, what are some of the duties that come with that?
So it's slightly different for early voting than for election day. For election day, there's kind of like a hierarchy of 3 different levels, and I'm at the lowest one. I'm a newbie. For early voting, it's there's only really one level. It's called election inspector. So as an election inspector, I can't speak for other states because every state has their own process. But in New York, you're working for one of the 2 major political parties on their behalf. So I could be a Democrat, a Republican, an independent. It doesn't matter. I have to call the representatives at the Board of Elections for either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. Say, hey, I want to work the polls on your behalf, and then they have their own like onboarding process. If they decide to hire me, I have to go through some training, and then when I arrive at the polls, I am working essentially on behalf of either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. And I will be partnered with someone who is working on behalf of the opposite party. And we are like, I'm not going to say buddies for life, but you get the idea. Like, we have to do everything together, and the idea is that each of us is checking the other to make sure it's fair. And I get why the Board of Elections does this. They want to have multiple people doing this from both parties to make sure to check everything, to make sure that no one can accuse the other side of cheating or something like that. So when a voter would come to our table, I and my person from the other party would sign them in on what's called a poll pad. It's like a little iPad. You may have seen it. We look them up. We confirm their identity. They have to sign off on the poll pad. And then both of us have to confirm it. If both of us decide to pass it, we then hand them the ballot. They vote either at the automark or with a pencil or pen, slide it into the machine, and then they're on their way. Important to note is we're not poll watchers. Our job isn't to represent any political candidate. It's to make sure the polls run smoothly. We're not in the business of challenging each and every voter, but especially this year, if someone decides that they want to challenge someone, they don't think this person is who they say they are, that is within their right. The person who is challenging the voter has to confirm their own identity and explicitly say why they are challenging the voter. And if they're willing to do that, then the voter has a chance to stand up for themselves. If they're willing to do that, they still get to vote. If not, then there are a few options for them. But people will find that out when they come on election day or early voting. For election day itself, there are obviously more poll workers. The inspector position is pretty similar to early voting. There are also what's called chair people and coordinators. The chair people, kind of like, I don't say they oversee the inspectors. They just manage our break schedule because we have to always have one Democrat and one Republican at every poll pad. The rule is this year, and they're like monitoring this, not with cameras, but like when the poll pads are activated. If a poll pad is activated and there aren't two people there, that poll pad has to go away. So the chair people's responsibility is to make sure that happens. There's also what we call poll site coordinators. They are the people who at the entrance to the poll site are saying, "Hi, welcome to our poll site. Here's where you vote. Like, let me check your address on this piece of paper. Oh, you vote at this table, not that table, et cetera, et cetera." At early voting, it's a little simpler because you can vote at any table. We actually print your ballot for you, which is, again, why you can vote at any poll site. And the responsibility of, like, the chair people, that goes to someone who works for the Board of Elections. We call them the poll site supervisor, and they will be handling the machinery. But, yeah, it's a very good civic duty. I highly recommend people do it. I know a lot of college students, like, we need younger poll workers. I'm being completely honest here. Like, a lot of the equipment is newer. It's like we use iPads now. We don't use physical paper. And I'm not trying to be offensive here, but sometimes people who are older don't understand like why we're using this new equipment, and younger poll workers can help with that. And I know a lot of college students don't do it because you have to miss class on election day. It's a very long day. We're expected to be there from 5 a.m. to 9 p.m. with only 2 one-hour breaks. I do it because I'm really invested in it. It's a really good civic duty. Not all people feel that way. You get paid, I think it's like $300. So, yeah, not that much. But I think it's a really important civic duty. And hey, if you work an election, a couple elections, you can even do early voting in the future. So yeah, it's very interesting, and I'm glad I do it.
Amazing. Thank you so much to Elijah Fisher for joining us today to talk about early voting and poll watching.